Hello, everybody. Hot off, so to speak, a show we did earlier this week with the radical regenerative American farmer Joel Salatin. He runs a remarkable farm out in Western Virginia called Polyface, healing the land one bite at a time. His farm is designed to get his food and particularly his meat to table as quickly as possible. We have another angle on the food crisis and the reinvention of food in America with my guest today, Nicola Twilley. She is the author of an important new book, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. You may also be familiar with Nicola. She is the co-host and co-founder of a very popular food podcast, Gastropod, and Nicola is joining us from Los Angeles. Nicola, well, congratulations on the book. How familiar are you with the regenerative food movement in the United States?
A little bit. I've followed Joel Salatin's work for a while. It's fascinating and really interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if when I saw him, I didn't know we were going to do this show. I think you'd really love your book. There are, of course, refrigerators, large ones, I think, at the Polyface farm. But his method of farming, his argument about what's gone wrong with farming, his critique of industrial farming is in some ways, I think, Nicola, is it similar to what you're arguing in Frostbite, or are you a bit more ambivalent about the industrialization of food?
Yeah, I mean, I think spiritually I'm with Joel. Practically speaking, I do see some of the arguments in favor of the food system we have, but yeah, fundamentally, I think we are both on the side of thinking, well, we do have a system that is not operating in necessarily in our best interests at this scale, and can we fix it?
Yeah, I have to admit, just before we went live, I went to my fridge to get some milk for my cup of tea, and you made me feel horribly guilty. What is it? What's the numbers, Nicola? That
I think it's 100.
75. Sorry, go on.
No. Say again.
Is it and quote and of course correct me if I'm wrong in terms of the book, but is 75% of the food we eat, do we take it from the fridge? That actually, I have to admit, if I had to guess, I would think it would be higher than that.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so the statistic is nearly 3/4 of our food passes through the cold chain at some point or another on its journey to your plate. So it's not that you personally store 3/4 of everything you eat in your fridge, because presumably you have rice and pasta, and that makes up a large, chunk of your diet too, unless unless you're sort of paleo or something. But on its way to our tables, a lot of food gets chilled, even if it's not the kind of food that you're going to keep in the fridge when it gets home. So bread, for example, industrial bread, that all spends time in the cold chain. Peanut butter, which you may or may not keep in the fridge. Some people do, I have discovered. That also is refrigerated on its way to us. So lots of things live in there for part of their lives, even if you don't put them in your fridge.
The book is called Frostbite. As an introduction, Nicola, perhaps you can. I, of course, looked up refrigerator on Wikipedia, but you're a much more reliable source and a more educated source than Wikipedia. Tell us the history of refrigeration. When did it begin?
So, yeah, I mean, one thing to say straight off the bat is your refrigerator is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole sort
So
of
to speak, of course.
yes, exactly, pun intended. There is a whole, what is technically known as the cold chain behind the fridge. So everything from refrigerated warehouses to shipping containers to supermarket chill cabinets to all the specialized sorts of architectures, juice tank farms and avocado ripening rooms that are also all chilled and all there to get your food to you. And what's amazing about it is that none of this really existed as recently as, let's say, 160, 70 years ago. So for a very long time, we have lived as humans on the planet and fed ourselves without refrigeration. Of course, for as long as humans have been, sentient, we have known that cold preserves food. People observed, you put your mammoth leftovers in an ice pit and they last a little bit longer. Or if you're in the Middle East and you're not blessed with, snow and ice, people would put bones in a cave, and that's a nice natural cold store that will preserve them for little bit longer. People got more ambitious with their use of cold. They found ways to harvest, store, and ship ice at scale. But it was only in 1755 that humanity managed to make cold from scratch, or I should say really produce cold, because cold isn't a thing you make. It's a sensation of loss as you move heat away from something. So it's incredibly recent, and it was 100 years after that the first commercial machinery was sold. So it is a surprisingly recent addition to our foodscape.
Yeah, in some ways, and maybe we can come to this later, it's the equivalent of air conditioning, or at least air conditioning for food. So coming back to the fact that we have only had refrigeration for a couple of 100 years, we've had cities, of course, for much longer. You mentioned the Middle East. Some of the greatest cities on earth were Middle Eastern cities, pre-industrial Middle Eastern cities. You and I are both from the UK. London was a large city before the middle of the 18th century. How did you live when it came to food? How is it possible to survive in the city when you didn't have access to farmland before refrigeration? Did people just eat whatever came into their homes?
Well, London in the 1750s is a great example, because it was beginning to get to the size, for the first time in human history, that it was actually too big to feed from the surrounding landscape. And so, previously you might have sort of marched your cattle into town. Oftentimes, for weeks, these animals would be sort of brought from northern fields down to the city and slaughtered in the city, because the meat can travel forever on the hoof. Admittedly, it's losing weight and becoming tougher, but it's you don't have a preservation problem. I mean, people even herded turkeys into town, which I imagine was not a lot of fun if you've ever tried to herd a chicken. But that's how that was done. As cities got bigger and bringing in things that were perishable became harder and harder, people resorted to all sorts of things. In London, there was a dairy underneath the Strand, and the cows were just kept in basements underneath the Strand to provide milk, and then they were given like a little respite graze above ground for a couple of weeks a year, sort of the summer holidays. So
That's an astonishing story. So there was an underground farm, essentially.
essentially, pigs, tons of pigs, thousands of pigs estimated to live in Kensington, one of the more expensive neighborhoods of London these days.
Some people, Nicola, might argue that there are still lots of pigs living in Kensington, but that's a off-color remark. I should.
There you go. No comment. But but it was increasingly a problem. And then for vegetables and fruit, the good news was there wasn't really seen to be any health benefit to vegetables and fruit for much of human history. They were sort of a frivolity and a luxury. So the poor in the cities didn't have to worry about them, and the rich had carriages and servants who could go out to the countryside, harvest these things, and bring them back that same day. So it wasn't that was how a city was fed for much of human history, and you can see that there is no really sort of scalable way to feed people perishable foods.
And presumably you had daily markets, and of course you had canning. The one area that I don't, and you mentioned the dairy before, the one area I don't understand how, and I guess people just didn't keep milk. I mean, either you got it and drank it, or you just didn't use it.
Oh yeah, you didn't have it in the fridge just for
Well, there
when
was
you
no fridge, so
exactly.
So
Yep.
what was how?
No, to be
Sorry, go
fair,
on.
people did have an array of ways of trying to keep food fresh in their homes. And if you're old enough, you will have seen some of these in, a north facing um, uh, room might have been the pantry because it was
Mm.
cooler. Or if you had a standalone house, well, a basement root cellar was cooler. Again, people had spring houses on their estates where the fresh flowing water would keep milk cool in the summer. These were things that you probably had if you were wealthy, built into your house and your estate. And you definitely didn't have if you were poor. You would have, but if you were poor, you weren't buying enough milk to stockpile anyway, so it wasn't a problem.
Does refrigeration have its own Edison, its own inventor, or were there a series of inventions that resulted in the refrigeration revolution?
So the first person to actually produce cold artificially was William Cullen, a Scottish doctor. He did it sort of as a party trick. He wrote a little pamphlet about it, said, "This seems interesting. Someone should look into it further."
And this was mid 18th century.
Yep, 1755. He did that, and everyone ignored it. Actually, interestingly, until the expansion of the natural ice trade suddenly made people think, oh, well, natural ice is so valuable, it's a global commodity now. It was being shipped from New England to Calcutta to Sydney. Um, People thought, well, there's a business here. What about if we look into making cold? So it turned people's minds to an existing piece of knowledge that hadn't been exploited. And you get a few different engineers at the same time who could all claim to be the Edison of cold. But the first person to actually sell a refrigeration machine, a commercial piece of machinery that created cold, was an Australian, actually. And he was a printer, James Harrison, based in Brisbane, and had noticed that when he wanted to type in he wanted to print his paper in hot weather, which it does get very hot in Australia. He would cool the type by rubbing it with ether, which as it evaporates off would cool the type and then the ink wouldn't smudge. And he took that observation and ran with it and created an ether-based refrigeration machine to sell to breweries. The brewers were the pioneers. The first refrigeration machine was bought by Truman's Brewery in London and a brewery in Australia, the Glasgow and Thunder Brewery. And it was, he had to come back to London to get it manufactured. The engineering uh, abilities in the colonies at that time were not up to the job of making this new machinery, but that's the first refrigeration machine in the 1850s.
And that's where we get cold Australian beer. Of course, we Brits have always enjoyed warm beer, but in all seriousness, Nicola, my understanding, again, I'm sure it's, as most of my understandings are usually wrong, is that people often drank beer as an alternative to water in the Middle Ages. How did this affect people's not just eating habits but drinking habits?
The rise of refrigeration.
Yeah.
I mean,
Obviously you could drink beer before refrigeration, but presumably it changed everything.
Oh, it transformed everything. And with beer specifically, actually, one of the big drives was around lager, because lager had become increasingly popular with, it expanded from its German homeland with sort of waves of emigration from Germany, particularly to the US. And you can't make decent lager without resting the beer in a cold space. And in the summer, that's called lagering, and but in the summer, is particularly in the US, in St. Louis and all these cities where Germans were moving to, you just couldn't do it. It just got too hot. And yet summer is when everyone wanted to be drinking a nice cold lager. And so they were the biggest customers for the natural ice trade, and they were the first to invest in this refrigeration machinery. So it allowed, and lager consumption, quadrupled as a result. But the beer folks were just sort of the early adopters. Next on the train was meat, and it had a huge impact on meat, particularly here in the US.
And
Suddenly,
yeah, I think of Chicago as the sort of the refrigeration city. Without refrigeration, presumably there wouldn't have been a Chicago.
well, people were already using it as a hub. So the railways had come. And so Chicago was a very convenient sort of hub to bring cattle who were being raised on the plains, and bring them to a central location, sell them, and then ship them live to New York. And actually,
Okay.
that was how it was done. There was so much cattle congestion that they built a cow tunnel under what's now 12th Avenue to try and kind of, they were shipping these cows across the Hudson River and disembarking them and getting these immense cattle jams. So there was a dedicated piece of cow infrastructure under 12th Avenue, that's got buried in the Javits Center construction, but archaeologists believe there still may be some traces there.
So it's rather like London. You look under a modern city, you'll find cows.
Exactly.
Nicola, is the cycle, the narrative of refrigeration similar to computers and televisions, that they began incredibly expensively and only the very, very rich could afford them, and then they became mass market products quite quickly?
I don't know about quite quickly in this case. It took quite a while. So that first refrigeration machine was sold in the early 1850s, and you don't start getting a domestic size, affordable machine that wealthy people, could buy until, but at least normal people, until the 1920s. So it took quite a while, and part of that was that those early machines were steam powered, so they were necessarily massive. Also, there were a lot of technological problems to be solved, including around what chemicals to use as the refrigerant, the chemical that you use to sort of produce the cooling effect. Early refrigerants were often extremely explosive, so you get a lot of refrigeration fires. They were considered uninsurable. So that was an issue. There was a lot of, just the question of sort of sealing up some bits of the machinery hermetically so it works reliably. That was actually invented by a monk in the south of France who wanted to chill his and his brethren's communion wine, invented the hermetically sealed compressor. So a huge number of leaps forward had to occur. The earliest home refrigerators, the company would come round, install the machinery in your basement, and then cut a hole through the floor to supply the sort of box with the door in your kitchen because the machinery was so big. So it really took a while, and before it reached kind of, like going from the gigantic room-sized computers to a laptop today.
And were there, just as there were early computer moguls as there are today, the Steve Jobses of the world, were there refrigerator moguls? Were there men and women, I'm guessing mostly men, who got ridiculously rich because they were the first, they owned or drove refrigeration technology or companies, either to consumers or to businesses?
A lot of the people who got rich were the people who took advantage of refrigeration. So one of the earliest refrigerator rail car lines was Busch, Adolphus Busch, and that's, Budweiser, Pabst, and Busch beer. Like, these are the big names you still hear today. Gustavus Swift in Chicago, Swift Meats, which until it was bought up by some of the big, Brazilian companies today, was one of the biggest meat companies in the world. He made his fortune figuring out how to ship meat using refrigeration. So a lot of people made a lot of money by working out how to use refrigeration in their industry. Within the refrigeration companies itself, it was actually General Electric who really jumped on this and made it work. They sold electricity, and so an appliance that was on 24/7 and sucking electricity that entire time was their idea of a gold mine. And they were already rich from all their Edison patents. So they just spent a fortune to popularize the electric refrigerator. They sent a fridge to the North Pole. They financed a musical. It was an entire campaign to sort of make a refrigerator the must-have appliance, an electric refrigerator specifically.
Perhaps it's the same way that the dominant Silicon Valley companies like Google, Microsoft now are benefiting from AI, and there seems to be some similarities in how reliant they are on power. What about food retail? Your book Frostbite focuses on how we eat mostly, our planet and ourselves. Did we see the appearance of refrigeration sections in supermarkets, in the Safeways of the world, before most people got fridges in their homes, or did they go together simultaneously?
They really went together. The first places that were refrigerated were warehouses, and actually the retail end and the home consumer end were slower. Now there's exceptions. The rise of the soda fountain was a place where you could get a refrigerated or chilled drink in a retail environment, but you were drinking that there. You weren't sort of picking it up out of a chill cabinet to bring home. So it was definitely a post-war phenomenon that really led to the kind of big supermarkets with lots of perishable foods that you drive to and you buy a car full of refrigerated foods to put in your gigantic fridge at home. And that was really made possible by an African American engineer who just before the start of the Second World War invented mobile transport refrigeration. If you drive around England, the US, whichever, you'll see lots of refrigerated trucks. They're one of two kinds often. They're either Carrier, he was the father of air conditioning, or Thermo King. And the Thermo King is Fred McKinley Jones, this African American engineer who finally figured out how to make mechanical cold mobile. And that's what led to the retail revolution and gave us the sort of supermarkets we have today.
I think we need to take a refrigeration break, Nicola. We want to remind everyone that great guests like Nicola Twilley are brought to us from our friends at Liberties, quarterly of culture and politics. I'm not sure if they have anything on refrigeration, but they cover most stuff. Gonna run a short feature, and then I want to come back and talk to Nicola about not just the upside of refrigeration, but some of the environmental and health problems associated with this profound revolution in how we live. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Nicola Twilley. I called her Twiley before, but she's Twilley. No E, although there is an E in her in her last name. We won't get into that. She's the author of a wonderful new book called Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. In the first half of the show, Nicola, most people be listening thinking, wow, this was a great revolution, changed everything, allowed us to get as much. It allowed us to refrigerate our food, to drink as much milk and fresh vegetables and meat as we wanted. So the upside is self-evident. But your book also suggests, and your research suggests that, like so many other aspects of modernity, that it's a more complicated story. Of course, if we had Joel Salatin on the show, he would already be telling us what a catastrophe it is. What's your take on the overall upside, and then maybe we'll get to the downside of the refrigeration revolution?
So upside, it can't be argued with that. I mean, first of all, yeah, cold beer is much more delicious. Sorry, to my English ale drinking ancestors. Ice cream is a wonder.
We haven't even mentioned ice cream. Yeah,
exactly. It no doubt food safety has improved a great deal thanks to refrigeration because, it prevents all those bacteria and fungi from multiplying and making us ill. There'd be no way for us to live the way we live now. And and not have refrigeration. Women in the workforce, I mean, that rises in lockstep with the adoption of refrigeration, because suddenly you don't have to shop and prepare food all day, and you don't have to spend your entire summer putting up, summer berries and fruits and saving them for the winter, which you would have had to do otherwise. It was an enormous part of the household labor that went to women that took hours and was removed by the fact that you can now go and buy fresh vegetables in the middle of January at the supermarket.
So in a sense, it's the food side of the washing machine, the refrigerator.
Yes. Yeah. An engine of domestic liberation. But as you mentioned, it's not all upside. And I think the downsides have actually been overlooked. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because there's a tendency to focus on the upsides. And right now, especially as large parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, much of Southeast Asia, is looking to build its own refrigerated food system. It strikes me that we do very well now to make a full accounting, not just of the benefits, but also of the costs. So while we have fully refrigerated our food system here, that isn't the case in much of the world. For the book, I traveled to Rwanda, which is a country with basically no cold chain. Nothing gets refrigerated. And so that's why this matters now, is because these places are going to build a system that looks like ours unless we think about how to make it better.
Nicola, we've done many shows on global warming, journalists, writers like George Monbiot. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. He just had a book out about grazing habits and why eating meat has resulted in so much more global warming. In Frostbite and in your research, how central is the refrigeration revolution with the global crisis of a hotter planet?
It's really at the center of it, I would say. It's potentially the most important aspect of food and climate change, and for two reasons. One is that the power to create cold, it's thermodynamics. You can't move that much heat around without using a lot of energy, and we can't generate all that energy sustainably right now. I don't see the breakthrough that is going to enable us to do that, especially if the rest of the world builds a cold chain the size of ours.
So there's no Moore's law when it comes to refrigeration.
We can improve the efficiency, but I am no engineer, but the engineers I spoke to said that we have really reached the limit of what they can see in terms of efficiency gains for the current technology. The other problem is the refrigerants themselves, the chemicals that we use to produce cold. Those have been identified by Project Drawdown as the number one. Refrigerant management is the number one thing that we can do to mitigate climate change. And that's because these chemicals, particularly the ones that are most popular in the developing world because they're not flammable and they're not toxic, those are super greenhouse gases. So many, many hundreds, even thousands of times more warming per ton than carbon dioxide.
We've done lots of shows also on regenerative agriculture, on the soil itself. To what extent is the refrigeration revolution bound up in the industrialization of farming? And as a consequence, from the point of view of people like Joel Salatin, the destruction of the soil itself?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and something that sort of emerged as I looked at this. Initially, I wondered why did refrigeration sort of seem to have this tendency toward scale? And it was actually an economist at the World Bank who explained to me, listen, this is technology that, regardless of what you do, adds about 5 cents to 15 cents to every kilo of food. And that is enough that unless you're doing it at scale, you can't actually make it work. And so you have to get those savings elsewhere to be able to make your product affordable. The equipment is expensive enough that it doesn't work for smallholders, even in sub-Saharan Africa, in places, companies that have, a sort of semi-nonprofit mandate to work with the smallest smallholders and lift them out of poverty, they told me we can't actually. We have to work with a certain size of farm because refrigeration makes zero economic sense at the small local scale. You have to you have to be able to sell your product for enough that local buyers probably can't buy it, and you have to be selling enough of it to justify the refrigeration system. And all of that gets you a system where you are growing for export rather than growing food locally to feed your local community. And all of that leads to a situation where you have these clusters of sort of specialization where California can grow sort of, 90% of the United States' lettuce crop because it's the center, the cost of transporting it and keeping it fresh is sort of negated by the scale of the operation.
So the subtitle of the book is How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. We've talked about our planet. We've talked a little bit about our food. Maybe we can come back to that. What about ourselves? Lots of people argue, including guys like Salatin, that this industrialization of food, and it's not just refrigeration, although as you noted, that's central, is really bad for us. It means we eat worse, we eat too much. It's the foundations of our obesity crisis, and so many other contemporary health problems. Is that a consequence, Nicola, of the revolution? Is that how we are all suffering from what you call frostbite?
It is to a certain extent. And again, I think I have to be a little more nuanced here. And while not sort of disagreeing.
It's hard to be more nuanced than Joel Salatin.
I think it's
I'm
hard
joking. I mean, he's one of the he's not very nuanced, but we always need polemicists in this.
Exactly. But that's not me. So I'm more of a, let's look at the evidence and find the nuance, because I think that's where the interest actually lies. And so I did spend some time looking at the health impact of refrigeration. Surprisingly, very few people have tried to assess this, which is astonishing again to me. Here's something that has so fundamentally changed what we eat, where it's grown. You would think it would have a health impact, and why that wouldn't be of interest, I don't know. But part of it is it's very hard to disentangle from all the other advances in the 20th century. But what we can say is there's pluses and minuses. So in enabling us to eat a lot more meat, because our meat is more abundant and much cheaper, that, as we know, has had negative health effects. On the other hand, people argue, well, there's a lot more fresh fruit and vegetables now. The challenge is knowing if we actually eat more of them. Data on fruit and vegetable consumption is really spotty. It doesn't. The USDA just didn't consider it worth measuring, and they weren't alone. Similar lack of consumption data in Europe too. Again, it was sort of an optional extra. So it's hard to say that it's definitely increased our consumption of fruit and vegetables. What it has done is that in breeding fruit and vegetables that are sturdy enough to survive our refrigerated food supply system, we have actually managed to breed out quite a lot of nutrients. So this is a sort of underreported topic, but the fruit and vegetables in the supermarket today have significantly fewer vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients than the ones our grandparents ate. And it's sort of a head scratcher. The USDA is sort of like, what happened? But if you trace it through individual crops, as I did, such as tomatoes, a large part of it turns out to be breeding for the cold chain. In breeding for something that was sturdy enough to be harvested when it's unripe, shipped across the country, artificially ripened, brought to our shelves, and still last a week in your own home's fridge. And we're asking a lot of our fruit and vegetables here. And in getting that, we accidentally bred out flavor and nutrients.
Yeah, you mentioned tomatoes. Americans, of course, say tomatoes. And they seem exhibit A on that front. I mean, refrigerated tomatoes are tasteless, but presumably people accept it, although many consumers simply don't understand what a fresh tomato should taste like. Is that fair?
That's completely fair. And what's amazing is you're echoing the language of a 1911 op-ed that was written after a promotional cold storage banquet that was held in Chicago. Because when refrigeration was introduced, people weren't keen on it at all. And you think, what was wrong with them? Were they stupid? But no, it actually it left consumers disempowered. Previously, you knew how old your fresh looking chicken was because there was no actual way for it to be anything more than 24, 48 hours old max. You knew that it had come from nearby. You knew what freshness meant in terms of time and space. Suddenly, that chicken could have looked fresh and been 6 months old. So people were very suspicious. This cold storage banquet was held as a sort of giant PR exercise. And an op-ed at the time said, listen, fine. So cold storage food won't kill you and it tastes like okay. But the only consolation is, it's undoubtedly going to win in the marketplace. The only consolation is future generations won't know what fresh food actually was supposed to taste like.
It's like so many other consequences of maternity. You've used the F word several times, fresh. What does that mean, Nicola? If does that mean that and the cover of your book comes with some frozen berries, if something is frozen, is it still fresh? If it's transported from the farm in a refrigerated lorry to the supermarket and not frozen, does that keep it fresh? How do we define even the word fresh these days?
It's a very, very good question. It used to mean that it hadn't been preserved, and in some way, like smoking, drying, salting, fermenting, that visibly changed its opinion. Then it came to mean something that was perishable and being kept refrigerated so it hadn't gone off. Now it tends to mean something before its sell-by date. I argue in the book, and I meet someone who sort of is discussing this, that it should mean that it contains all of the things, the chemicals, nutrients, vitamins that were in the plant when it was harvested. So as close as we can get to that, that's what freshness means.
Nicola, what about the socioeconomic, the class element here? I live in San Francisco, you're in Los Angeles. There are lots of expensive markets, farmers markets. There are now very fashionable farm-to-table restaurants. But it seems as if this is increasingly the privilege of the wealthy. Have quote-unquote poor or middle-class Americans benefited from this, and it's the wealthy who are rebelling against the fact that their tomatoes in Safeway don't taste of anything?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely make that kind of argument, and people do. One of the tomato guy I speak to in the book, who's trying to return flavor and nutrients to tomatoes, says the reality is that most people don't want to eat like Alice Waters, the Berkeley Chez Panisse chef who's sort of famous for farm to table cooking. And they don't because it's expensive. It requires you to eat seasonally, so you can't eat the same thing all year round, which takes a lot of mental energy for people who are already working a job, two jobs, looking after children, looking after elderly relatives. Now they have to think about what's in season before they cook dinner as well. So you can see that, but for both reasons of convenience and cost, that a refrigerated food supply chain that is going to give you exactly the same thing all year round is probably worth the sacrifice of a little flavor. My question is, can't we do better at a scale that is still convenient and affordable? So it's not saying, the person working two jobs must now also, burden themselves with finding seasonal vegetables at their farmer's market and only serving their family that. It's to say, why is refrigeration the only way to get fruit and vegetables to people in an economic manner? It doesn't have to be. When refrigeration was really first sort of implemented at this mass industrial scale after the Second World War, There was a book written about it, and the final chapter says, like, this is just the latest and greatest in our ongoing sort of technological battle to try and preserve food. No doubt we'll come up with something better sooner. And I sort of feel like, well, why haven't we? And why can't we?
Haven't we, though? I mean, we've done shows on the technology of urban farming, of stacking buildings with farms. Obviously, biotech is changing some of the potential in farming. Is there technology out there now, Nicola, which will enable for and you keep on using the word scale, it's a Silicon Valley word, the production of food at scale, more affordably, more accessibly, so that the environmental and health crisis of refrigeration can be ameliorated?
I think so. And I don't think the only issue I think is it's not going to be a single silver bullet for everything we eat. Now, refrigeration has the advantage that it just sort of works on most things that we want to eat. It doesn't necessarily work on everything. There are an awful lot of varieties of fruit and vegetables you don't find in your supermarket because they actually can't be refrigerated successfully. But it works on enough that we can get what is, an adequate diet refrigerated. So it's sort of like a one-stop shop solution. Whereas some of the solutions I look into in the book for other ways to preserve food actually only work, say, on produce. So one of the most exciting is a California-based company called Appeal that creates a coating out of food particles. They actually mine exclusively things like tomato skins and avocado left over from, guacamole factories and things like that for their molecules that they use. So they only get them from food. They make this nanoscale coating, and it gives fruit and vegetables the same shelf life out of the fridge as it would get in the fridge. And that's incredible. In the US, of course, it's being used as an add-on. So rather than, take our produce out of our refrigerated supply system that we've already built, people are just sort of buying extra time and removing packaging. Walmart's using it, for example, right now on English cucumbers as a way to sort of get rid of the plastic wrap. But it's been used as a sort of add-on bonus here in the US. But in a place like sub-Saharan Africa that hasn't built a cold chain, well, maybe they don't need to build as big of a one if they're not going to put produce in that cold chain. And so this is and we can go into the science of how that coating works. It's incredible technology, but to my mind, what's exciting about it is that's right. The problem is how to keep food fresh, how to preserve food. The problem is not how to create cold sustainably necessarily. It's how do we keep our food fresh? And being creative about that solution is really exciting.
Well, people can get more into details, Nicola, in the book, Frostbite. I'm guessing just as people now trying to live without computers and social media and cars, there is a food avant-garde trying to live without refrigerators. Do you know anyone who has chosen to live without a refrigerator?
Oh, yeah. And I actually interviewed a few of them for the book. The thing about that is, unless you also are going to try and live completely self-sufficiently and, get, hunt, farm and fish all your own food, you're still connected to refrigeration because our food passes through the cold chain on its way to us. So unless you're not buying anything, as well as unplugging your fridge, you're not really unplugging your fridge. I mean, it's educational because you obviously, one of the big problems with fridges is that they tend to increase food waste at the domestic level. People put stuff in the refrigerator and then they forget it's there and then it goes bad and then they throw it out. There's sort of this sense of the refrigerator is a bank vault that you could just put stuff in and it'll be fine. But of course, eventually it goes bad. And so it is educational to live without a fridge, but it's not really taking you out of the system. If you go really out of the system, then yeah, that's a commitment to a very different kind of life, and one that I would argue doesn't really work very well at the individual level. You'd want that to be God forbid, a hippie commune.
Well, it's going back to what we talked about before. Only certain types of people can afford to live that way. It's an important subject. I'm amazed, actually, no one's written this book before, but it's always the best books that seem the most obvious. Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves by Nicola Twilley. I'm going to end, Nicola, with a very personal question. Tell me about your fridge.
Well, for the book, one of the things I did was meet a refrigerator dating expert who, obviously, that's the thing you could do here in Los Angeles because we are the most shallow city in America. And this man will...
Shallow or shallow?
Shallow. Appearance-based. And this man will match you and assess your compatibility based on the appearance of your fridge. And so I sent him a photo of my untidied up fridge, and he gave me his notes. And apparently I have a very dateable fridge, which is good to know. I am actually happily married, but in case, you never know.
Why is it dateable? Because there's so much in it?
Well, no, he really liked the amount of alcohol in there. Sorry, Mum. And there was a variety of different kinds of alcohol, which he found evidence of a sort of convivial nature. He liked the fact that I had my leftovers in Tupperware rather than just sort of in the original containers. He thought that was evidence of me being sort of on top of things. The array of different condiments, a lot of different condiments going on. Rather than blaming Ottolenghi, he said that it was evidence of me being adventurous and willing to try things. So there you go.
So if you can't afford it, or you don't live in Los Angeles and you don't have access to a refrigerating dating expert, would you suggest that if you go on a date with someone and you happen to find yourself back at their home, that you have a look in their fridge?
I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean,
it's like looking in their underwear.
I think you can get a lot of information out of it. I mean, he sort of gave me some examples, and since then I do confess, I look inside people's fridges and I do judge them. And it is, now, admittedly, like the New York Times tried to do this sort of as a culture war thing, and they found that people couldn't guess a Biden fridge from a Trump fridge. So,
I saw that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not just like if you have, a mega manly mountain pizza that you're automatically going to vote for Trump. And if you have kombucha, that's it, locked up as a Democrat. But I do think it tells you something about, I mean, I would never want to be with someone who had a filthy fridge. That's just, it wouldn't work.
And I have a huge amount of milk in my fridge. I don't have a cow, but I got about as close to a cow as you can get because I drink a lot of milk. What does that tell me about me? I drink a lot of, not milk, of tea. So my fridge is dominated by my milk supply. Does that mean I'm married as well? But does that mean that I probably shouldn't go back on the dating scene?
I mean, I would be a little suspicious about that, to be honest. But now you say it's for tea, I feel reassured at least.
Well, Nicola, congratulations on the new book. I feel refreshed, if not frostbitten, by all this conversation about refrigeration. The new book is Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. It's one of those books that both is very serious, but at the same time, very entertaining and interesting. Congratulations on the new book. And what's the next book, Nicola?
Oh, no, I think there'll be a while before that one comes out. But you can, in the meantime, I'll carry on making Gastropod. And I write for The New Yorker, too. So I have a couple of New Yorker features in the works.
Good. Well, then we'll have to have you back on the show, Nicola Twilley. Congratulations on the new